Hello, and thank you for being a part of our channel today. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of John, and we're in John chapter 6. Even though there were those who disagreed with Jesus, who fought against him and said all kinds of things contrary to what he was trying to do, he did not allow those individuals to keep him from doing what he knew he was there to do, and that was the will of the Father. He continued on even though there were those who disagreed with him. And that's something that we need to realize too. We've got to continue to follow the Christ, even though there may be some who will be against us and will even say things contrary to us. Now, in chapter 6, we find that Jesus, of course, is continuing to perform miracles. And as we said, those miracles that we're talking about, yes, indeed, was to the benefit of those who were in need, but even a greater need. It was for the benefit of those who were in need of spiritual help. And so we find here in this particular chapter, in John chapter 6, it says, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And so, of course, we realize that sometimes when a country is conquered by a different country, the names of the things, such as seas, will be changed. But here we find that we're talking about the Sea of Galilee. And so now we find that Jesus is back in Galilee. He is there at the Sea of Galilee. And notice in verse 2 it says, and a great multitude followed him. And I could just imagine the influence that Jesus had upon those of his day and how that they would just want to follow him, to hear what he had to say, to do the things that he wanted you to do, and to watch the things that he was doing, and how that would, of course, cause you to believe in him as the Son of God. And notice it says in verse 2, a great multitude followed him, because they saw the miracles which he did on them that were diseased. And so you just would want to find out more about him and see even more of what he was capable or able to do. Notice in verse 3 it says, and Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he set his disciples. And notice it says, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. And when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw the great company that came to him, he said unto Philip, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now, of course, Jesus is going to help his disciples that their faith might be increased. And remember, as we said, those miracles were to cause faith and also to increase faith in the lives of people. Now imagine here you are, you're Philip, and the Lord turns to you and says, well, where are we going to buy food for all of these people? Well, that's a problem. In verse 6 it says, and this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. And so Jesus knew what he was going to do even before he asked this, but this was to a benefit of Philip. Don't know exactly why he picked Philip out here, but possibly it was that Jesus knew that Philip needed a little boost as far as his faith was concerned, and thus, as a result, he was asking Philip and trying to put Philip in charge of these things. And of course, we find that Philip said, Lord, we don't have enough money. He says 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for this. And so, we don't have enough money, and if we even did, it'd be too much as far as the amount of food that we would have to buy. Then he goes on and he says that every one of them may take a little. And so, if we were able to go out and buy food for everybody, they wouldn't be able to eat a whole lot. They would not be able to eat until they were filled. And then in verse 8 it says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, there is a lad here which have 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? And so here you have Andrew trying to help out a little bit. It just kind of seems to me like Andrew is one of those guys that just likes to help. Because when he learned that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, he went to Peter, his brother, and helped him that he would come to the Lord as well. And so here you have Philip, I don't know what to do about it, Lord. And then you have Andrew joining in. He said, well, there is some food here, but we don't have enough for all these people. And then in verse 10, Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. Now, what happened here? You only have this small amount of food. You have 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, and yet they just keep giving food out to all of these people. All of these people, 5,000 men, and we don't know how many as far as the women and the children are concerned, but they just kept giving food, and giving food out to the people. Notice it says in verse 12, and when they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing is lost. And then it says in verse 13, therefore they gathered them together and filled the baskets. How many baskets? 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above them that had eaten. And then in verse 14 it says, then those men, when they saw the miracle that Jesus did, said, this of a truth is that prophet that should come into the world. Now, what does it do? It produces faith in their lives. Now, could you imagine knowing that you only have 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes, and you start handing out food, and you just keep handing out food to everyone, and then gathering up, as it says here, how many? 12 baskets of the fragments of food that was left over? Could you imagine that? Well, this, of course, does indeed show the power of Jesus. It is also proof of the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. It was to help his disciples to realize that Jesus is that prophet. Matter of fact, you can go over to Deuteronomy chapter 18, and you find in verses 15 and 18 that Moses talked about Jesus as being that great prophet. And then, of course, when you come over to the New Testament, you can come to the book of Acts in Acts chapter 4. And how that Peter, of course, in Acts chapter 3, refers back to what Moses said there in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15, verse 18 and 19, and tells us that Jesus is the fulfillment of what Moses talked about. Because Moses talked about, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever ye shall do, and whatsoever he shall say unto you. Now, the point being is, we need to listen to Moses, and we need to understand that Jesus is that great prophet that Moses talked about. And not just the great prophet, he's the very Son of God. Well, remember that the Jews were not willing, some of the Jews were not willing to listen to Jesus, and even Jesus made the statement, you know, you're not willing to listen to Moses and to believe that I am he, the Son of God. Now, here you have these individuals who were involved in this miracle, saw what happened based on the miracle itself, and believed in Jesus as being that great prophet. Well, thank you for tuning in today. We hope and trust that this has been a blessing to you, and we'll continue tomorrow in John chapter 6.